All right, folks, welcome to Mr. K's at-home taxidermy animal preservation series. We're having a lot of fun here. Today, what I'm going to be focusing on is skeletal articulation. So like taking a dead animal skeleton and then preserving the bones and then reassembling them into that animal or into whatever part you want to save. A lot of people do European mounts where they just do the skull, and that makes a lot of sense. It's simple, it's fairly easy. You can find things that were roadkill. This is a great example of a project to do to roadkill that you don't have to handle a lot. What I had was some fresh animals that had passed on, and so I found them, got them, and what I'm doing is I'm going to preserve the bones. So I kept them in the freezer. What I did actually is I started by skinning them out. I deboned as much of the meat off as possible, trimmed everything off that I could, and then I froze them because I didn't have time that day to finish them up. Now today, my plan is to take those bones, which I thawed yesterday by throwing into a cooler, and I'm going to pull those bones out, clean them up just a little bit more if needed, and then separate them out and put them into a cooker and kind of simmer them for about 4 or 5 hours because I'm working with a small animal here. If you had a large deer skull, 5-6 hours maybe, but you don't want to truly boil because if they're boiling, you can damage the bones a little bit. And then we'll talk about degreasing later. So episode 1 here, bone or skeletal articulation, is getting them ready and cleaning. So I go to my cooler here. Pull my bag of bones out. They're thawed. And this should be super pleasant. Here we go. There's a leg, as you can see. Put that down here. Another leg. I tried to keep the legs together, so I didn't completely separate everything out. Now there's an advantage to doing that. The main advantage being this is a puzzle. I want to do a full skeleton, a full skeletal articulation. This is going to be a puzzle. If I keep the pieces to, one leg at a time, it makes putting the puzzle back together a lot easier. I ended up with a few skulls here from this project. They're not clearly all from the same animal. It'd be funny to assemble them with 3 skulls, but that'd be kind of odd. All right, so you'll notice what I did is I took and trimmed off a lot of the meat already. Okay, I gutted the animal, I cleaned things up. There's a lot of meat on here still that could be trimmed off right now. I'm actually not that worried about it because of the fact that I'm going to put this into a cooker and slowly cook it. It should make it like a roast. Like it's just going to fall off the bones. The meat's going to come off pretty easy. And this being ribs, my biggest concern is saving these ribs, and I don't want to lose them. You've got some cartilaginous pieces that may break down and come off, and I may not be able to get those back on. You can recreate or restructure some of this cartilage with I find hot glue actually works really well if I make a little mold and do some hot glue with it. The other thing is the vertebrae. The vertebrae look really unique. You can tell. One big thing I like to do is I will take a picture of this because this is showing me that my vertebrae with the longest points here are going to be right around where those ribs will start coming off, okay? I know what my cervical vertebrae look like. The first one being very large and the rest a little smaller. My lumbar vertebrae are very different in shape and texture. So I will be trimming this one up for you in this video, hopefully. The legs, you'll see I got the leg here. I left it attached, but I got as much meat off as possible. I could trim off a little bit more here, which actually I might do shortly. So skull I cleaned out. I got the brain out because if you cook it with the brain in, it can be really hard to remove afterwards. That can be a big pain in the neck. So I removed most of the brain. And what I'm going to demonstrate now is trimming up around the bones, around the bones. Here, so let me lower this a little bit. All right. I'll get my All right, I'm using just a classic scalpel here. I prefer to use scalpels in my work here because it's easier to clean. It's easier to replace the blades. I don't know. If you have a good sharp pocket knife, that's totally fine. So if I can get position here, I don't exactly have the right equipment. I can take and trim off quite a bit of this meat. And the goal is to just, anything you get off now, you don't have to take off later. That simplifies it. And because this is fresh, it doesn't smell. It's not real disgusting. So that's also helpful. If you're working with roadkill, a lot of times you might trim off a little bit and then just cook it down. The other thing you can do is macerate, where you just sit it in a bucket of water. And a lot of people will bury their bucket for a period of time or set it out for extended time. And that will definitely break it down, but it's also going to rot and smell really bad. And I don't like that. All right, so my limbs, I'm going to call good enough. And I'll show you what we do after that. I will trim a little bit of meat off the vertebrae here. Looking right here at the cervical vertebrae. I want to try to get some of this stuff off because it'll just make it a little bit easier. And then when I go to take a picture of it, because again, take a picture of how this animal is put together. It will really simplify a lot of the putting back together. I like to take pictures at this stage, especially of these limbs, because a lot of these smaller bones down in the foot, in the foot pad, can have a huge, they have a huge impact on putting it back together. If you're looking at all these bones going, wait, where does that go? Having a visual of it will help out a lot. There are some good images online, but you'll want to, having your own pictures is also beneficial. All right. So working some of this meat off. And I don't want to spend my whole time trimming off meat and showing that to you. 4 hours. Sorry. Yeah, this kind of project takes a little bit of time, not 4 hours. I just had the kids asking me what time bedtime was. All right. I could also take and trim off in between each rib, but I'm going to wait on that. Again, I'll do it after cooking. One thing I will do is I'm going to cook some of these ribs separate, or some of these vertebrae separate, because if I have all these in together, sometimes I'll mix up my cervical and my lumbar. So to separate these vertebrae, you just kind of trim around. It's really not too bad. And then you kind of just want to separate. Don't want to break the bones at all, but just want to separate there. So now I split the vertebrae there. You can see a little bit of spinal cord there as well. But I trim right there. And the vertebrae will split along the actual joint. You'll see the joint of the vertebrae has two little parts down here and two up here that hinge on the next one. So it's kind of cool. But so this I'll know is my lumbar vertebrae. This I'll know is cervical just because it's still attached to the area up here. I don't think I'm going to split that into a third. I'll keep this separate, and the legs. Now, a lot of people will be like, oh, you just throw it all in a thing and macerate it, let it break down, and then you have all these pile of bones. That's a 200 and some page piece puzzle. I'm not interested in doing a 200 and some piece puzzle when I can break it down to, 30 to 40, maybe 20 some pieces at a time. So how do I cook this down and keep this separate from the others? You could do different pots. That's a pain in the neck. And I actually have a Nesco dedicated to taxidermy. It's my taxidermy cooker. So what I'll do is I'll fill that. I'll take this cheesecloth here, which once again, this cheesecloth isn't going back inside for anything but taxidermy or really skeletal articulation. So I'll take a chunk of cheesecloth. I'll make myself a little bag. And that's how I'll manage to keep all this stuff together. So I take the leg, set it down in my cheesecloth. I'll wrap. I'm gonna wrap a few here. And the cheesecloth will allow it to cook and simmer together without it going everywhere. It'll hold the pieces mostly together. Sometimes you get a little toe or something that slides out of there, but most of the time, again, I'm just simmering. Shouldn't be too bad. How do you fasten that? Twist ties. They work slick. Really simple. If you don't have twist ties, you've got this nice cooking string, right? Stuff you use to tie up a turkey or whatever. Now, a lot of times I would sit and label these because when I'm doing this with class, we'll have 3 or 4 raccoons going at once. And so we'll label raccoon 1. Now, how do you label? The best way I found was to have kids take a different color ribbon for the different animals. So we had the green raccoon, the blue raccoon, the yellow raccoon. Then I would have them, if they were worried about, well, I had the left front and I had the right front. First off, you should be able to tell once you pull that out what's the left and what's the right. But sometimes you can't, especially high school students can't. So what I'll have them do is then label with like a bead. Okay, the left front gets a blue bead, the right front gets a yellow bead, the left rear. So that simplifies it, okay? Just ways to do it if you're gonna teach this stuff or work with multiple animals at a time. Like for example, if I was heating this up and I only have 1 raccoon, not a big deal, but if I'm bothering to heat this up, maybe I want to put 2 raccoons in or and do them at once. These can make, what we're going to do is basically make a specimen that's an articulated skeleton specimen that a person could actually, put in a museum or put in a nature center. These are great for nature centers, stuff like that. So let's get there. I'm not going to sit here and bag up all this in front of you because that'll make the video a little bit longer than it needs to be. I got a bag in here. Put it in my Nesco. I fill it with water almost to the top. You want all of it covered, okay? The goal is to have the whole thing covered. Then I use one of 2 things. If I have borax on hand, I'll use a little bit of borax to cook it in. That'll help to degrease. It'll help to pull a lot of that stuff out of there. Don't go away. If I don't, Dawn dish soap. That degreases really well. Now, depending on the type of animal you have, after you cook it, you'll pull it out, you'll look at the bones, and they're gonna need another step, okay? After I trim off any of the meat that was ready to fall off the bones, they're gonna need another step, and we'll get to that in video number 2, okay? This is gonna be a 3-part series, I believe, maybe 4. First part being, how do you get bones? 1, roadkill, whatever. You can macerate, you clean them, cooking. Then step 2 is going to be, where you take and then whiten and degrease. So we'll use ammonia. I like to use hydrogen peroxide. Never use bleach. People say, oh, bleach the bones. Yeah, it's a phrase, that's fine, but don't actually bleach the bones. You're gonna have some damage there. So we'll do some hydrogen peroxide. I'll show you some tips on that. And then the 3rd step is once those bones are ready, how do you assemble them? What do you use to glue them together? Rods, pins, wire, and we'll assemble. So this was step 1. Thanks for joining me. If you have questions, shoot them along.